For those of us in the business of providing rental housing, dealing with professional tenants is the ultimate nightmare. These are the tenants who can afford to pay rent, but who refuse to do so deliberately in order to live rent-free at the expense of the property owner. These tenants also know how to delay an already long eviction process while they seek to find the next place to live and the next property owner to victimize. Today, we'll hear from investigative reporter Ryan Kath and his producer Shira Stoll of NBC 10 News Boston. They'll talk about a series of news reports that they conducted about a specific pair of professional tenants, Linda and Russell Callahan, who have gotten away with cheating numerous property owners in Massachusetts and elsewhere over the past 20 years. Attorney Jordana Greenman will provide legal analysis while describing the tactics of these professional tenants and how the system in Massachusetts overlooks this problem and how it even encourages it. At SPOA, we believe in tenant rights, but we also believe in a fair and level playing field for both tenants and property owners alike. This is the only way to attain the goal of increasing the supply of maintained and affordable housing. We hope that these conversations will usher in the reforms needed to protect the small property owners who provide the majority of rental housing in Massachusetts, and to give them a ray of hope so that they don't have to suffer in the shadows any longer. Hello, everyone. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the Vice President of the Small Property Owners Association. We'd like to welcome you to episode 10 of our series about property rights and housing policy. I'm happy to introduce Mr. Ryan Kath, who is a reporter, an investigative reporter with NBC 10 Boston, and Ms. Shira Stoll, a producer with NBC 10 Boston. Thanks to both of you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Amir.
Happy to be here.
And joining us once again is Ms. Jordana Greenman. Jordana is an attorney who represents small property owners. This is also her third time on the program. It's wonderful to have you back, Jordana.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
As a big tent organization, SPOA represents the rights of all property owners, but we primarily champion the small business owners, the small mom and pop housing providers who provide over 60% of the rental housing in Boston and throughout the Commonwealth. It's important to remember that many of these businesses are female, minority, and family owned. Many of us are immigrants. I can attest to my mother's history. When she came to America, she was excited to be an American citizen, and all she really wanted to do was to give back to her new country and her new people by providing them with safe, maintained places to live. And I mention that because we are facing this antiquated stereotype about landlords. You know, we're not lords of the land, obviously, but people seem to think that we're all evil, we're all greedy, that we don't care about our tenants. And, you know, that couldn't be further from the truth. There may be troublemakers or bad actors on both sides, but most renters are good people, most owners are good people, and it's a sensitive ecosystem. You know, small owners are generally more available to their tenants. I'm not knocking the larger corporations, but when you think about the way that we do our jobs as small mom and pop businesses, we do it in a more hands-on way, which means that we are more readily accessible to our tenants, and we are better able to provide them with that human interaction, that sense of not only unity, but a lot of special friendships develop. And we don't hear about those special relationships. They say that no news is good news, and I have two people who work in the news industry who can attest to that. But we don't hear those good stories enough. And what happens, what people need to understand is that when you endanger the small business owners, it affects everybody negatively. It affects the quality of housing, the availability of housing. It makes life more difficult for the many good tenants who depend on us to provide them with decent places to live. It negatively impacts all the other businesses, the tradespeople, for example, who rely on people like us to provide them with jobs. And so we have to protect that ecosystem, and we have to advocate for fair policies that are just for everybody, for all stakeholders. With that, I just want to remind all of you to please support SPOA in our efforts to achieve that level playing field. You can do this by going to spoa.com/join and making a donation. Again, that's www.spoa.com/join. We're a group of volunteers. We work hard to bring you programming like this, monthly newsletters, email updates about pending legislation. We've appeared in the news, in print and visual media with interviews and publishing articles of our own. It's our pleasure to do it, but we do need your help. And you don't have to be a property owner to stand with us. Again, it's spoa.com/join. So today we're going to be talking about a case involving professional renters, a husband and wife by the name of the Callahans. And Ryan and Shira are going to tell us about a news report that they did about these renters, and I'll pass the floor to you two. Can you tell us can you give us a description about these two people, how you came to find out about them, what motivated you to pursue this story, and what you found?
Sure, Amir. It actually started last year. The reason this topic landed on our radar is we did a series of investigative stories about a detective sergeant with the Stoneham Police Department. And what was happening with him was that we got a tip that he had gone years without paying landlords his rent. And essentially, he had used his position as a police officer to get away with this for years and years and years. And we finally looked into it. We're able to show like a 20-year history of doing this. And following our reports, he was actually arrested by the FBI and charged with wire fraud. He was eventually convicted and obviously lost his job as a police officer. So following that series of stories, we actually got other emails from people who wanted us to look into this concept of professional tenants. And so that's where Shira and I kind of put our heads together and thought it would be a worthwhile topic to explore.
So I really just Googled the term professional tenants, and I found a blog post by attorney Richard Vetstein, who wrote about the Callahans and said that they had 16 plus evictions. So I went into mass courts, saw all those cases, and went to Ryan and said, I think, we have a story here. And the next day I went to the Worcester court and I pulled hundreds of pages of court documents from those 16 evictions. And then we went through all of those pages together, calling different landlords that were named on the court cases. And that's really where the story began. And then it really just took a bunch of turns after we had, interviewed some of the landlords. We interviewed an attorney who had evicted them, I think, 5 times. And then after we had done those interviews, we didn't know where the Callahans were. So the last known eviction was in December of 2023. And we had interviewed that landlord, and we knew that they were in a hotel after that eviction, and then we couldn't find them. And do you want to tell a little bit about how we were able to find them?
Sure. Yeah, I think the first major question that popped up after seeing this history was, how in the world have they been able to get away with this for so long? And that was kind of the crux of our initial story, where we were able to share the narratives of all these different landlords. And it was crazy to kind of put their interviews next to each other, because the MO was always the same. They were finding ways to target small landlords who maybe had never rented a property before. They came from a variety of backgrounds, but they were somewhat naive at the time because this was their first time, and they took the Callahans' word for it. The Callahans were very adept at smooth talking landlords, gaining trust. They seemed proactive because they would come with a stack of documents that they said were their pay stubs from jobs, credit report, And not knowing any better, these landlords said, wow, these people are really on the ball. They know what they're doing. The Callahans were always then able to get into a property shortly after they had written the check for a security deposit and first month's rent. And then by the time the landlords learned that the checks had bounced at the bank, the Callahans were already in the property. They were very good at making excuses and coming up with reasons why the funds hadn't transferred. And it always took a while before the landlords came to the realization that they'd been scammed. And then they discovered they had to go through this lengthy eviction process to get rid of them, even though they'd never been paid a dime of rent. And then on top of that, they would find out they also had to pay the moving expenses to get rid of them. They would have to pay, you know, for the constable to come forcibly get them out of there. And then potentially they'd have to store their belongings as well. So these people collectively had these stories that almost mirrored each other. And they were all exasperated about how the system would allow this to continue for so many years. So that was kind of our first story. And then we kind of got in for a next story more about like the legal issues.
What was stunning, I think, for us in our reporting was that each of the landlords basically had the same exact story. It was just back to back to back, you know, this excuse, that excuse, and that it had been going on for so many years, but just that each one, the same exact thing happened, you know. They were sweet talking them, oh, like they had a vision for the place, things that they wanted to do. And then, you know, the fake documents. It was just crazy that each person just had that same story. So I think that also was just one of the most compelling parts of the story for us.
The first episode kind of ended on a cliffhanger because we had gathered all these different interviews and we had this compelling case. But we couldn't find the Callahans. We didn't know where they'd ended up. And if history gave any indication, it was that they had this pattern where maybe every 6 months or so, a new eviction would pop up. So we figured, okay, it's only a matter of time before we figure out where they landed next because the eviction case is going to show up somewhere. So we were checking every single day mass courts to see if there was a new case. We were checking other means that we have to figure out if somehow a new address was connected to them. And then we finally came to the point in time where we said, you know what, we shouldn't sit on this any longer. We have so many amazing interviews. And this is, you know, it's really an important story about a systemic issue that has allowed to continue for 2 decades now. Let's just put the story together. We'll obviously continue trying to figure out where they are. Maybe someone will see the story and give us a call the next day, and then we'll be able to go from there. So that was kind of the mystery of how our first segment ended. And from there, Shira and I decided that we could send a letter to their last known address in Shrewsbury with forwarding service and delivery confirmation and all those things. And so we finally got notification a couple weeks later that it was delivered to a PO box at a UPS store in Shrewsbury. So from there, we had to do some surveillance at that store. And we waited a couple days of being there, and we finally saw one of the Callahans show up to get some packages at the Shrewsbury location. Yeah, so it was a little shoe leather reporting for this part.
You confronted one of them on video, did you not?
Correct. So we finally were able to, we basically followed them to see where they were currently living, which at the moment was an extended stay hotel in Westboro. And the opportunity came where Russell Callahan was outside having a little smoke break. And we seized on the opportunity to finally ask him about his history and scamming all these landlords out of, you know, what's well over 6 figures worth of unpaid rent at this point. And as soon as he saw us, he was like a deer in headlights and he bolted for the door, which, you know, is usually someone that knows that they've done something wrong.
Right, right. I was actually amazed in the first part of the segment, the first report, when you were referring to the way that they were sweet talking the property owners. It was always the same comment, you know, we love your place, we're going to respect your property, you know, essentially you'll have no trouble from us. And it's, you know, those are the words that property owners love to hear. And I had an experience personally with the same type of tenant who, you know, it brought a smile to my face in a way because I had the same experience. He told me the same things. And then right when he moved in, similar to what happened with the owners in your story, his checks started bouncing right off the bat. And I know that in the story with some of these owners, they fabricated illnesses to justify not paying rent. And, a good number, or at least one of the owners who made it into the piece said that, well, because of this, I felt so sorry for them. I allowed them to live there without rent. And as Jordana will tell us, those are the owners who suffer the most, because next thing you know, when you're dealing with a professional tenant, several months will go by without receiving payment before it finally occurs to the owner to launch the eviction process, which in Massachusetts takes a very long time. If we were in a state like New Hampshire, you could get rid of tenants like the Callahans in maybe a matter of days or weeks, maybe 2 weeks, something like that. In Massachusetts, you're lucky if it'll take you 9 months to 1 year or a year and a half or even longer than that. But I think, Shira, you mentioned 16 property owners. Was there any evidence that they defrauded more than 16?
Well, so there were 16 cases in Matt's courts, but then in our reporting, we saw that there was a 4-year gap, and we were able to pull some records from Florida and saw that they had 4 cases in Florida. So actually, the property owner that you were just referring to, who said he felt sorry for them, he was actually an active duty in the military, and he owned a house in Florida, and he had rented to the Callahan. So he was actually overseas while he was trying to deal with, excuse me, he was overseas while he was trying to deal with, trying to get them evicted from his property.
I think that was one of the most compelling anecdotes in the entire story, was because he was overseas on his first deployment. He noticed the rent check hadn't gone through, so he was trying to contact the Callahans, and he was finally able to get through to Linda Callahan on the phone, and she told him her husband had been in a horrible work accident and was in the hospital with, like, on life support or something like that. And this landlord felt so terrible for them that he actually sent flowers to the house from his overseas deployment, obviously unaware at the time this was all just part of the scam.
We know that tenants like this are in the minority relative to the greater tenant population. It's a small number, but it's also a small number too many, because if one set of tenants can make so many property owners miserable, along with other tenants who may have resided in these properties, if one couple can do that to, let's say, 16 or 20 owners, think what 5 Callahans can do, or what 10 sets of Callahans could do. Jordana, I'll turn it over to you. How does this stack up or compare to other cases you've had? And does this come as a surprise to you?
Surprise? No. And I would say that the professional tenant issue goes further than just people who pay first, last, and security and then bounce around. Because as some people know and some people don't know, unfortunately, evictions have gotten significantly more time consuming since COVID. It's still hard. It was always hard. It was never easy to evict people in Massachusetts, but just the things that go into it have become more complicated. The time standards have been extended, and there's really people who've learned how to play the system so well. And I think that knowing that the Callahans, there's a woman in Eastern Housing Court I've had 4 different evictions against, 2 with one landlord and 2 with other 2 landlords. So 3 landlords, 4 evictions, same person. And if you look her up in mass courts, similar 15 cases or so. There's, people who know how to really sort of prove one thing is wrong so they can, kind of take the landlord to the bank. And then there's a situation that I'm dealing with now, who it's a tenant that a friend of mine evicted in 2018. He actually took a knee in the courtroom, and the judge told him, "This is not a football field, get up." He appealed that. He dragged it out for a long time. But at that point in time, in 2018, this person still had a housing voucher. So eventually he agreed to leave. moved into the new place. My client bought the place in October of 2022, a month and a half after this person has lost his voucher. He was never paid. We are still fighting in the appeals court. Every single time we go to court, this man appeals. The appeals court now has a pilot program for self-represented litigants. They kind of give you an outline of how to do things. And so one of the problems is that our legislation and our court system arguably encourages this behavior because there's no penalty. So these Callahan people, they could probably get away with it again. They could do something as similar as only using one L in their name because it won't be as easy to find if you just write Cala instead of the two L's. There's people with, in certain cultures, people have two last names. You can use one of them. You're still arguably that person when you go to apply. There's all these tricks, and the state basically hands you the playbook. Hey, you look up tenant answer and counterclaim, tenant answer to summary process. You get a whole 19 pages of check boxes to check off and hand into the court. It's so easy. It's so easy to take advantage of people. I do not know what it's like other places, but this whole being able to go from place to place and do this, it is a serious issue. And I don't know how we get the attention of the legislature to start doing something to protect landlords, because this really, I don't think this happens as much in, say, an Avalon Bay building, an Equity residential building. I think that their checks and balances are different. I think they're stricter when it comes to, yes, you need to pay first, last, and security, but those companies are probably also not in as much of a rush. They have time to wait to make sure your check cleared. My clients, somebody leaves on the 30th of the month, they want to get somebody in on the 1st, they pay, they think it's paid, it's over. You can't always save yourself. And it's just, it's horrifying, and it's legal. So because it's legal, and it's a confusing thing, because a client will say, oh, so what, so they can just stay in my property for months and months and not pay rent? Well, not really, but yes, logically, that's how it works out, because the law does not have a rent escrow requirement. You can go to court, you can be taken to court, you can say you have COVID 7 weeks in a row, and then your court date will be postponed 14 weeks, because if it's every 2 weeks, then you keep saying you have COVID. There's no checks and balances. There's no questioning of anything that anybody says. Motions to remove defaults are routinely just allowed. The judges don't usually pay that much attention to the standard. And I think that it is the real fear of homelessness, and this image that somebody who's not experienced in property closes their eyes and think about homeless people, they're going to be flooding the street, and this is horrifying, and it's cold and it's snowing out, but not thinking about this woman who owns this brownstone 2-family, she lives on 1 floor, her tenants paid her once. We don't really think about that person. We just think about, oh no, there might be a homeless person, but there's so much more to this law than people really acknowledge. And it's such a serious issue, and I think it's causing small landlords really to just block, sell, buy a single family if they can, or become renters again if they can, because it is such a big hit when you have something such as what the woman that I came on once had, Wildia Capri, where the tenant just destroyed the property. She only now is getting the property back. She now has a tenant. It was at least 6 to 8 months and $30,000 of putting the property back together from all the damage. This was real stuff. This was a real person who worked her whole life to buy this house. And I think there really needs to be more checks and balances to avoid people running into these professional tenants. Unfortunately, the legislature just went the other way. So now you can look to have your eviction record sealed. If it's a no-fault eviction, you can do it right away. If it's non-payment, you can do it after 4 years. And if it's for cause, you can do it after 7 years. So you literally could have assaulted and battered and armed robbered somebody in your property, but 7 years later, you can say, hey, I really don't have this eviction record anymore. Can you please remove it? there's going to be no checks and balances. The court is not going to make sure that the other side was served with the paperwork. It's just it's gonna destroy any, landlord ability to do due diligence. And it's scary. It's really scary. And I do not promote homelessness. I do not think anybody should be homeless. But I do believe in a level playing field, and we just don't have one.
Well, amen to checks and balances. And I remember when you came on with Wildia, you made a powerful comment when you said that the system refuses to acknowledge that property owners like her exist, and there are so many of them out there. In fact, those types of owners provide the majority of rental housing that's out there. And it's just shocking that these people have had to suffer in the shadows. And we can return back to the legislature in a moment, but to Ryan and Shira, I just wanted to ask you, considering everything that Jordana said, and considering what you learned from this report, did this experience change your view about rental property owners in general? Did it open your eyes? Did it surprise you as you went along? Or was this just another story that you were used to hearing?
I think there were a lot of things that opened our eyes with this particular story. And the biggest thing was just the staggering number of people that they'd affected, the amount of money that they'd been able to basically steal over that many years. And, Jordana actually reminded me of several things that we came across during our investigation. One of the things being how adept professional tenants are at delaying the eviction process through filing things like motions and just basically continuing to move the goalposts back and back and back. And it doesn't seem like there was ever a thorough review before those were approved based on court audio that we listened to during the course of a reporting process. One thing she mentioned that I just thought of going back to the initial story we did about that Stoneham police officer, we found during that he was able to keep delaying his eviction cases because he would say he had a pending raft application in, a rental assistance. And that was like an automatic stamp for delaying the process. Whereas anyone could have easily asked a question and said, well, what do you do for employment? Oh, I'm a detective sergeant with a police department, and his payroll records are publicly available. And so that was what we did as part of our reporting to show that he was averaging well over $150,000 of income every year and would never even come close to being approved for rental assistance. So that was something that surprised me during that story, was that, well, doesn't someone vet to see if someone actually A, has an application in, or B, would even ever qualify based on their income? So that was one instance that surprised me from the starting point of actually kind of looking into these eviction stories. And Jordana also mentioned how people can change their names. That's something we saw the Callahans do with their most recent eviction in Shrewsbury, is all their paperwork they submitted in terms of pay stubs and other things, and also their rental application, was done under the name Callahan. And that was basically so they could avoid detection if the landlord happened to jump on mass courts and look through an eviction history.
And there had been a couple other cases where they changed their name slightly. They added a G somewhere, and similarly with like one L. There were a couple of cases. So even when we were searching mass courts, I was searching, CA in the last name, so not all of Callahan, and then, RU for Russell or LI for Linda, just to see if there were other variations of their name. I think for me, the most surprising thing that I learned was, so the Callahans, most of the checks that they wrote had bounced. So they didn't, when they put in the security deposit, first month's rent, none of those checks actually cleared. So that is technically larceny by check, which is a criminal charge. But those cases would get kicked back to housing court saying, oh, this is a housing court matter. So even though technically it was a criminal charge, it wasn't actually, they were kind of thrown out and said, oh, this needs to go back to housing court. So that was, in our second reporting, we focused on that because even though it was criminal, it was just being kicked back to housing. And then it would continue that process again, where there would be more delays and more delays. And that's why the evictions would take so long to happen. So for me, I thought that was one of the most eye-opening things, because, you know, if someone's being charged criminally, you would think that it would be taken as a criminal charge, and it wasn't.
And it was happening
That's-
in plain sight. Everyone knew the Callahans. You know, I know when Shira went to the courthouse to pick up the documents, they said, "Oh, you're here for the Callahans." They all knew them.
Yeah.
The judges knew them. I think one of the most amazing anecdotes we heard from one of the landlords is when they called a moving company to get a quote. The moving company said, "Oh, just out of curiosity, who are you evicting?" And they said, "Oh, Russ and Linda Callahan." And they said, "Oh, we've already moved them out several times. We don't have to give you an estimate. We can tell you exactly how much that's going to cost you."
My
Wow.
goodness, that's unbelievable. Tell me this, given that the Callahans were household names in the court, by that point they were celebrities in their own right, did each eviction case still take longer and longer the more that they behaved this way? Or, in other words, by the time they got to eviction case number 15, when everybody, once the system became familiar with these people, did case 15 take just as long as case number 2 way back when on their resume?
I think there
Or
were a variety of time frames. I mean, you had the poor landlord who got stuck with them during the eviction moratorium during COVID. They were out a lot of money. I think the only one we saw on more of a rapid track was the most recent one, where the landlord's attorney was able to argue that they had used a fraudulent name on their rental application, and therefore were able to get that moved along a little faster. I don't know.
I think it took maybe 2 months, and it was acquisition by false pretenses because they lied about their name and gave them all false paperwork. And so that's the only reason that they were able to get out so much faster.
so, Jordana, I mean, we just heard that they committed crimes, they were criminals, but still the case got bounced back to housing court rather than criminal court. It makes me wonder, if they had actually committed murder, would it still have gone back to housing? I mean, what's going on in Massachusetts? I mean, how does anybody justify that? How could that happen?
Because it just really, the system is just designed that way. And it'd be interesting to see if Ryan and Shira ever interviewed legal services and their role in this. Because again, I do not believe in homelessness. I believe in a level playing field. I have no problem with people having attorneys. What I have a problem with is dishonesty, fraud, scams, assisting in such scams. So interestingly enough, and I think Amir might be, eventually we'll probably do one on this, and it might be an interesting subject for Ryan and Shira, is the landlord in Northeast Housing Court that lost his trial and was ordered to pay all this money to the tenant. And he met with a bunch of people, including myself, as for lawyers, and he eventually retained me. And we're going to be soon breaking out a motion to undo the whole trial, because guess what? He just found out the tenant is actually not the person that she said she was. She's a completely different person with a completely different name. And there were a few red flags along the way, but he didn't really know what to do with them. Like, if he was ordered to repay her the security deposit, so he wrote her a check. And the next month, she signed the check over to him saying, "This is for my use and occupancy." And he thought, well, why wouldn't, but now we know she's not that person. She couldn't go to the bank and cash that check because she is not the person who the check was written to. And it's just unreal that legal services represented this woman throughout a trial, put her on the stand and said, "Please state your name." She said that name. She's not that person. And I asked myself, I also do closing. So of course I get identification from people for closing. When I meet with landlords, I mean, what I tend to do is I look at the assessing records for the whatever city or town. But after I heard about this, I started actually asking people for ID, because it's a very serious problem. And I think when you're a state agency being paid by the government to do your job, it should be the bare minimum. Making sure that these people walking into the Northeast Legal Services building are actually who they say they are. Because this was a very harmful thing for this person. He's living in the house with this person who is pretending to be somebody that she's not. And there's people who do that, the changing of the names, the changing of this, or, there's plenty of people out there named Jen Kelly, or, these common Boston-ish names that you wouldn't think that's not me. That person has all those eviction records, but that's not me. Look, I have this common name. My name is John Doe. My name is Jane Smith. It's too easy. And it's interesting what you asked, Amir, because I would think, not the courts didn't make these take less time. They make it take more time. And depending upon where you are, it's going to be worse. There's no real uniform rules of summary process. There's a book that says it's called the Uniform Rules of Summary Process, but I will tell you from my own experience, litigating is, for instance, a jury trial in the Eastern Housing Court, which used to be called Boston. If the person demands a jury trial at the tier 1, you don't settle, they give you the immediate status conference 2 weeks later instead of having a trial 2 weeks later. Metro South Housing Court for Brockton, Canton, they don't. You just wait. You're in wasteland again. You have no idea what's going to happen next or when. And all you have to do is download a piece of paper from the internet that says, I want a jury trial. You don't have to have any intention of having one. The fact that this is a known abuse and nobody's doing anything about it. There should be, landlords have to have a hearing to get use and occupancy pending a jury trial. It should be a quid pro quo. You should have to pay your rent if you want that. You should have to. And nothing else should matter. Pay it to the court, pay it to the attorney. You should have to pay it. Because the reality is, at least in most of my non-payment cases in 17 years, this idea of withholding, no. Because if you were withholding, you would have the money today. And I often say in mediation, if you were ordered by the judge today to pay this money, would you have it? The answer is always no. I wouldn't. I spent it on something else. Because I have mice, I have mold, everybody has mold, everybody has mice, everything is falling apart at the seams. And all these owners are just sitting there doing their best. I'm sure there are some landlords that are bad. They must still exist. But if they exist in this state, they're just idiots. We have a very high standard here. But there's no way to weave your way through this system as a landlord, as a small landlord, dealing with somebody like that. They don't have flyers that they hand out to landlords. They don't have free forms online to check off boxes. If you do something as little as put the wrong date on the bottom of the form, your case can get dismissed. If your notice to quit says something different than the summons says, which, these are not things that regular people know. If you're not, I've had people come to me and their case was dismissed because they sent a 30-day notice just saying, I want my property back. So the tenant stops paying. So then when they go to file the summons, they say non-payment of rent, not realizing that's really not what they were evicting them to begin with. But at the base level, what about judicial economy? What about people not wanting to have more than one eviction in their name? There's this constant encouragement of more and more and more. And every case that I see dismissed without prejudice. Why? Why not give more time? Add some more time to the case. Okay, make the landlord fix something. Okay, but start again from the beginning after writing an opinion that teaches the tenants how to do it all over again better. It's horrifying. And legal services really, you when you go to Boston on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'm not saying that some people don't have hard lives. We all do. But these students from Harvard eating up these things these people say like it's gospel. And it's not. Anybody can say anything. I can call and claim somebody's attacking me. Right now, it doesn't have to be true. The police will come, they'll write a report on it. It's insane the lack of actual evidence required in these types of situations. And once you learn how to do that once, why not do it again? These Callahan people really kind of made their mark. They got by good. They're probably millionaires by now. And it's just, there's no honesty and there's no requirement of honesty. And it's so hard to watch as a regular person that now is more pessimistic probably than I started out as a lawyer, because I see so much terribleness in this system.
It
And
means
it's
that you're
hard
more
to-
needed than ever also. You made a lot of compelling points. Let me ask you, when it comes to legal services, and I don't want to make accusations, but it's just really unbelievable. Do you think that it has to do with negligence or complicity, or is there a fine, blurry line between the two?
I don't want to believe that it's complicity. I think it's sort of that we want to prevent homelessness mentality where nothing else matters on your way to homelessness. There's no other thought. These students, these 2Ls from Harvard with their noses in the air, walking down the court halls and walking over to me and saying, and they can't breathe and they have mold and now they have lung disease and this and that. It's like, huh? They've lived for 3 months and they got lung disease from living there. That's very interesting.
Right.
You
So
go to
there's a
Harvard?
micro
How did you get
focus.
in?
Right. There's a micro focus on preventing homelessness. But at the same time, if you run the property owner out of business, what happens to the home? You know, that's
Well, I mean,
like,
and that's what I like to tell people. What are you trying to do? Because if they, oh, I get it, because the post foreclosure tenants actually have more rights than regular tenants. So why not just make the landlord lose their house and then you get to do it all over again with somebody else? And if it's the servicing company, oh, we can really screw them over. You know, there's just no, it's just it's the most lopsided. The standards for landlords are all the way up here. I had an 85-year-old man on the stand once. He didn't keep ledgers. He was 85. He's been doing it forever. He had one of those old books from Staples with the yellow paper, and the judge asked for his ledger, and then that's all he had. And she yelled at him and berated him for not keeping good records. He's just some guy. He lives in his house, and he has 2 tenants that live there too, keeping the records as best he can. But the standard that I should have to buy a 2-family house and have a tenant. So I have to start having rental income programs on my computer, and I have to start keeping all these records. But I was just a regular person that couldn't afford a single-family house. It's
right. And last time when we were talking together, we were talking about certain rules in specific cities where at the inception of the tenancy, the property owner has to give written notice to new tenants about how the tenant can sue the property owner step by step, basically giving bullets to the tenant so that the tenant can use those bullets against the property owner. It's almost like handing someone a shovel and asking them to dig their own grave with it before the relationship actually begins. Ryan and Shira, I want to bring the two of you back into this. And I also, just to see what your reactions are. And I'm also curious to know, when Ryan was talking about Raft, why don't we get some more commentary about Raft and the problems with it? But I'll open up the floor.
Well, I think pertaining to the Raft, I don't have a really vast expertise in how that whole process works. I just know that I was very surprised that a public employee, like a police officer who has a very publicly available salary, was able to use that to continue to delay his own evictions. And it didn't seem like there was any kind of vetting process in the housing court to ensure that someone actually had a Raft application, and if so, would ever be able to qualify for it. And from what I understood of talking to other attorneys who were involved in eviction cases, is that if someone said they had that, it was pretty much a rubber stamp that the case would be continued. So I think, Shira and I were just talking, I think the main thing we're looking at now with the Callahan story is to see that now that they've been exposed and that people are aware of this history, will they be treated any differently the next time they do this? Or there is actually a pending criminal investigation into them with the most recent eviction in Shrewsbury. That was the example where they used the fake name. They bounced the checks, which, as we mentioned earlier, is a larceny criminal charge here in Massachusetts. If you knowingly write a check from an account that's either closed or doesn't have the funds, that's a crime. And so we're just waiting to see if things materialize differently this time. And if what they did and what's now out there in the public sphere, if there is another quasi Callahan out there, will they be looked at differently in housing court? We did actually come across a recent decision that a judge made in an eviction case with another professional tenant. And from what I understand, the judge actually did something pretty unique, is he looked at that person's housing court history and saw that he had done the same thing in a rapid succession, same type of MO as the Callahans, where you get in, write the check, it bounces, and then you try to stay in the property as long as possible. The judge actually looked at that and said that he never intended to actually rent this property, he was only trying to get in, and therefore should be called a trespasser, which Jordana might be able to talk about this more, but that's pretty significant from what I understand, because if you're trespassing in a property, you wouldn't have the same rights as a normal tenant who could wait out the eviction process as long as possible.
It is and isn't true, because I mean, it's gonna depend on the judge what the definition of a trespasser is. So I often have cases that are family members evicting family members and things like that, and they're considered not tenants, but they're also not trespassers. So I mean, technically, that's why you can't call the police, because if you say somebody's trespassing, it has to mean that they were never invited at all. They weren't welcome to be there. They shouldn't be there. But I really like to go as, and I know this is going to sound pretty dramatic, but in my experience, I think that it's dangerously close to saying, Ryan inviting me over for dinner. Maybe people drank too much. Maybe they didn't, whatever happened. I went to the bathroom. Everybody forgot about me. And I don't come out again until everybody goes to sleep at night. And he wakes up the next morning and says, why are you here? And I say, I'm your tenant. Evict me. And I don't leave. He's going to have to go through the court process. The cops are not going to do anything about me. And no matter what, even if it takes only a month, it takes time. You have to get to the court. The court doesn't think of anything as an emergency unless you're a criminal and you need to be arraigned or you're about to be homeless. Those are the only things that are actually considered an emergency. So I think if there is a recent trespass case, I think that's great. There might be some judges are veering more that way. I did get somebody out once who was the girlfriend of somebody. She wouldn't leave when he broke up with her. It took 6 months. 6 months. She had never paid anything. She didn't even pay for groceries. And it was just, it's unreal how much is handed to people. I would love to know which court, do you know which housing court that came out of, Ryan?
That was a Central Housing Court.
Okay.
If we move back to the issue of the legislature, educating them, making them aware of what's going on, one approach could be to encourage the property owners who've been victimized to go and talk to them to tell their stories. But Jordana, I have a feeling that you would say it's better to have the state representatives and state senators actually come to housing court and sit there for a few days to get a better understanding of how these stories typically play out. I mean, any thoughts on that? Anyone can answer this.
Wait, if what?
Well, I think in the past, you were saying that a lot of education needs to happen. We were all saying it, when we were talking about these issues with regard to how the legislature is out of the loop with regard to the struggles of property owners in these cases. So what would be the best way to make them understand? Would it be a private conversation in their offices, or would they be, I mean, I know they're pretty busy, but it seems to me that to really hit home the point, we would have to invite them to the housing court to actually watch these cases, right?
Yes. Yes, I think they should. When I see these policies, when I see, again, I'm all for immigration. I'm all for rights. I just don't love that there are veterans being asked to be removed from rooming houses so that people coming to this country who need sanctuary can live there instead. It's, it's one of those, it's a hard topic to discuss because we don't want to offend anybody. But we don't have surplus housing in Massachusetts. I don't know why anybody thinks that we do. And it's kind of crazy to me that that's what people really think. It's pretty unreal.
Thank you. Shira and Ryan, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important to note what a professional tenant is. I think that sometimes that term gets tossed around or people might not have heard it. But especially in the case of the Callahans, I think it's important to note that these are people who are employed, they can afford to pay rent, they know the ins and outs of the court system, and they know how to get these cases delayed. And then while they're getting evicted, they're already looking for their next place to live. So I think it's important that, people know that moving forward.
And if people who haven't seen your news stories wish to access them, where can they see the videos?
You go to NBCBoston.com/investigations, and you can scroll back through. That's all of our coverage. Or I just checked right now. If you Google NBC Boston and professional tenants, all three of our segments will come up. So that was the original story where we profiled all the landlords that had been victimized. Then we looked at the legal issues. And then we have a third segment where we finally were able to confront the Callahans.
Thank you very much. And Jordana, do you have any advice for property owners in similar situations? And if they need to reach you, how can they find you?
Yes, I think it's a sad thing to have to think about, but people are not always what they seem. People are not always what they say. I do think that giving people a chance is a great thing. And if somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I lost my job last year, I just got back on my feet, I'm really doing everything I can to try. Hey, sure, give that person a try. But if you're a property owner and somebody gives you a check, wait till the check clears, till you actually let them have keys, things like that. That is part of it. The police aren't going to help you. And I'm more than happy for anybody to contact me if they have questions. My email address is Jordana, Jordana, @jrglegal.com. And I am here for small property owners, and I will continue to be.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, it's more important than ever to donate to SPOA and to support us so that we can prevent these horrible things from happening. And as Jordana said, to create a level playing field for all stakeholders in housing. Please go to spoa.com/join and make a donation. If you wish to volunteer, you can email us and we can talk about that further. But it's very clear to everyone that property owners, small property owners in particular, they're not only vulnerable within the present system, but when you think about all the proposals on Beacon Hill for the future, rent control among them and other proposals, there's a long list that we were successful in defeating this past legislative session. But that's even scarier. Those proposals are going to take a bad situation and make everything 100 times worse. We all agree that tenants should have rights, but in the spirit of a level playing field, I think we have to acknowledge that there has to be a line, the line of fairness. That line has to be drawn. Activists have a tendency to demand more and more. If you give them inches, they'll take miles. If you give them miles, they'll demand even more. And they're going to keep demanding and demanding until property owners have no rights whatsoever. And we have to prevent that from happening for the good of all of us. We all have to be human. We all have to be fair. So please join us to fight the good fight. With that, I'd like to thank Ryan, Shira, and Jordana once again. Please join us when we come back next month for another episode. Please remember to tune in. My name is Amir Shahsavari, and until next time, I wish you well.